Officer Rachel Franklin thought a uniform gave her the right to rule the streets. She thought she saw an easy victim in a quiet black woman observing a local storefront. She didn't see a citizen. She saw a vagrant. She didn't see quiet compliance. She saw an opportunity to exert absolute dominance. But when she violently grabbed that calm woman and slammed her forcefully against the cold metal of her squad car, she made the single biggest mistake of her life. She didn't know that the silent woman absorbing her abuse wasn't just another helpless civilian. She didn't know that the woman memorizing every broken protocol was Charlotte Law, the city's newly appointed police commissioner, conducting a plainclothes inspection. And Charlotte wasn't going to just fight back in the street. She was waiting for the perfect moment to strip Franklin of her badge and dismantle her corrupt career entirely. This is the story of how a street-level bully picked a fight with the ultimate authority. If you believe no one is above the law and love a story of righteous revenge, hit subscribe. Let's watch the untouchable finally get touched. Charlotte Law stepped out of the administrative tower just after dawn, the hour when the city was still shaking off sleep, but the streets were already shifting into their usual rhythm. She'd left her tailored suit behind. No crisp blouse, no polished shoes, no protective entourage shadowing her like a second spine. Today she wore jeans, an oversized hoodie, and sneakers that had seen too many miles. She blended in so cleanly that even the security guard at the lobby barely glanced up as she walked past him and disappeared into the morning. That was the point. Her first day as police commissioner wasn't until Monday. There would be press conferences, staged handshakes, photo ops with the mayor. There'd be a ceremonial pinning of the badge, a department-wide email sent out with her face at the top, and a carefully crafted speech about transparency, accountability, rebuilding trust, and other promises every incoming leader is expected to make. But Charlotte hadn't come for ceremony. She came for truth, unfiltered, unguarded, unmixed with protocol or pretense. She wanted the city as it was, and more importantly, she wanted her officers as they were when they believed no one important was watching. A passing bus drowned the corner for a moment, its brakes hissing as it pulled away. Charlotte inhaled slowly, letting the familiar scent of diesel and rain-soaked pavement settle into her lungs. This had once been her escape route. These streets, these corners, these storefronts. Long before she'd become a lawyer, long before she'd joined internal affairs, long before the mayor handpicked her to clean the rot out of the department, Charlotte had been just another black girl who kept her head down and her eyes sharp. She'd learned early that some cops treated their neighborhoods like occupied territory, and she'd learned even earlier that silence, when used correctly, could be the sharpest blade. She crossed the street and drifted into the flow of pedestrians heading toward the open-air market district. A pair of uniformed officers stood outside a coffee shop, laughing too loudly, recounting last night's bar fight like it was a comedy routine. One of them imitated a suspect's limp with cartoonish exaggeration. Charlotte didn't break stride as she passed, but she felt the old, familiar knot of irritation form low in her stomach. It wasn't anything overt, nothing actionable, nothing she could condemn with a policy memo or firing. But these tiny fractures, carelessness, ego, casual mockery of the people they swore to protect, were how entire cultures of corruption took root. A weed doesn't start as a forest. It starts as a seed. A push notification vibrated on her burner phone. The mayor again. She ignored it. He wanted confirmation that she was preparing for the press cycle. She was preparing, but not in the way he expected. She walked several blocks without drawing a single glance. That was the benefit of dressing down. People only noticed you if you were a threat or a nuisance, and Charlotte had mastered being neither. She paused at the corner near an old hardware store, its windows cluttered with faded sale stickers and dusty electric drills no one had purchased in a decade. She leaned against a brick wall and watched the street, letting the city show itself. Delivery trucks, kids on scooters weaving dangerously close to traffic, a man arguing on Bluetooth, a shop owner sweeping his doorway with the kind of early morning bitterness that suggested he did it every day and hated it every day. A patrol car rolled slowly into view from the far end of the block. Charlotte didn't straighten, didn't shift, didn't do anything except slide her hands into the front pocket of her hoodie and keep watching the storefront like any other passerby waiting for someone or killing time. She wasn't here to provoke anything. She wasn't here to set traps. But she was here to see. The cruiser came to a stop near the curb, engine idling. The officer behind the wheel was alone. White, female, mid-30s. Wide stance, squared shoulders, a jaw perpetually set as if bracing for an insult she hadn't heard yet. Her nameplate was too far to read from where Charlotte stood, but her body language spoke loudly enough. This was a cop who walked into every encounter already convinced she needed to win something. Charlotte's gaze flicked upward only briefly, but long enough to see the officer looking right at her. There it was, the stare. Not the glance officers gave when scanning for safety or assessing a scene. This was a different kind of appraisal, the kind that ran up and down someone's clothes, searching for clues of belonging. The kind that sorted citizens into categories, resident or outsider, customer or loiterer, harmless or suspicious. The officer's eyes narrowed. Charlotte looked back at the hardware store window, refusing to take the bait. Her heart rate didn't spike. Her breathing stayed even. She had been here before, too many times growing up, and far too many times afterward during undercover investigations. But now, if this cop decided to escalate something out of nothing, the consequences wouldn't end with a bruised wrist or a night in holding. Charlotte wasn't a powerless teenager anymore. She wasn't a junior I. A detective sneaking evidence behind closed doors. She was the incoming police commissioner, the woman with the authority to fire entire units, gut precincts, dissolve task forces, rewrite policy, and demand consequences where none had ever existed. The cruiser door opened. Charlotte didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even turn her head. If this officer wanted to show her who she really was when she thought no one important was watching, then this was exactly the kind of truth Charlotte had come here to witness. And she was ready. Rachel Franklin liked mornings on patrol for one reason only. Most people were too tired to argue yet. The city wasn't fully awake, which meant the streets were hers in a way they wouldn't be once the day heated up. She sat in her cruiser, sipping the watery station coffee, tapping her nails against the steering wheel in a sharp, impatient rhythm. Her shift had barely started, and already she was irritated by the traffic, by the radio chatter, by the woman who'd taken too long counting coins at the bodega register when Rachel stopped for gum. Everything annoyed her. Everyone annoyed her. It was her default setting. Unit 12, patrol check, the dispatcher asked over the radio. Yeah, I'm alive, Rachel muttered before pressing the button. Unit 12, all clear. She took another sip of the coffee and grimaced. So swill, she said out loud, tossing the cup aside. It bounced off the passenger seat and rolled onto the floor. She didn't bother picking it up. She was already pulling the cruiser back into traffic, eyes moving over the sidewalks with the kind of suspicion most officers would call vigilance, but which, in Rachel's case, had curdled into something sharper, uglier. Two teenagers cut through a crosswalk a second too late. She honked long and aggressively, even though she technically had the red light. One of them flipped her off. Rachel grinned. "Real cute," she said. She considered pulling them over just to ruin their morning, but she held off. Not worth the paperwork unless they mouthed off again. Besides, she preferred easier targets, people who didn't talk back, people who didn't think they had the right to. A block later, she spotted a homeless man curled up against the brick wall of a closed laundromat. He was asleep, wrapped in a blanket that looked like it had survived several winters too many. Rachel slowed the cruiser. She wasn't allowed to harass the homeless. Technically, there had been trainings, memos, new sensitivity initiatives the department pretended to care about. But there were always loopholes if you knew how to phrase things correctly. She rolled down her window. "Hey," she barked. "You can't sleep here. Move it." The man startled awake, eyes wild and confused. "Officer," he mumbled, already scrambling to gather his belongings. "Faster," she snapped. "You can't camp here. Find somewhere else." He nodded frantically, shuffling away with quick, fearful steps. Rachel didn't feel guilty. She felt satisfied. A small, petty satisfaction, but it counted. She kept driving. 3 blocks down, she saw a young mum wrangling 2 kids outside a corner store. The kids were running circles around her, laughing. The woman looked overwhelmed, her hair barely hanging onto its messy bun. As Rachel passed, one of the kids accidentally tossed a juice pouch onto the sidewalk. Not maliciously, just clumsy. Rachel hit the brakes anyway. She rolled down her window again. "Hey, pick that up." The startled mother froze. "Oh, sorry, he dropped. I wasn't talking to you," Rachel cut in sharply. She pointed at the kid, who couldn't have been older than 5. "You. Pick it up. Now." The boy hurried to grab it, eyes wide with fear. "Raise your kids better," Rachel commented, before pulling off. The mother stared after her, too shocked to respond. Rachel felt that same little pulse of control she always got when someone bent under her voice. Not enough to satisfy her, but enough to start the day right. She turned onto Maple Street, the market district. Vendors were dragging out carts, store owners lifting metal grates. A group of old men drinking bitter coffee on milk crates at the corner scattered slightly when her cruiser approached. Rachel soaked it in, the way people tensed when she drove by, the way conversation dipped, the way eyes flicked away. Fear. Respect. The same thing, really. And then she saw her. A woman standing alone in front of the rundown hardware store, hands tucked into her hoodie pocket, gaze fixed on the display, like she was casing the place or killing time. Hard to tell which. Rachel's lips curled. She knew this type. Quiet, suspicious, out of place, pretending to be invisible. The woman didn't look toward her cruiser, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. That annoyed Rachel more than anything. "Okay," she murmured to herself. "Let's see what we've got." She pulled over and parked with a deliberate slowness, making sure the woman heard the engine cut off. Rachel stepped out, boots hitting the pavement with the confidence of someone who believed the sidewalk belonged to her. The woman still didn't turn. Strike 1. Rachel adjusted her belt, glanced around briefly for witnesses, not because she worried about getting in trouble, but because she preferred an audience that kept its head down. This block usually did. She approached with the swagger of a cop who lived for confrontation. People thought policing was about law, about service. Rachel knew better. For her, it was about control, about reminding people who was in charge, about walking into any situation and knowing she had the power to ruin someone's day or their life, if she chose to. As she drew closer, she saw the woman clearly. Calm, still, observant. She had a kind of quiet presence that made Rachel bristle. She didn't look like someone who belonged on this block. She didn't look intimidated either. And that, to Rachel, was reason enough. "Hey," she said, voice hard and authoritative as she stopped behind the woman. "You got a reason to be standing here." It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. And Rachel Franklin was already certain she was going to win it. Rachel closed the last few feet between them with the slow, deliberate tread of someone who wanted her presence to be felt before she even spoke. The woman didn't flinch, didn't look back, didn't do anything that a guilty person usually did when confronted by a cop. That alone irritated Rachel. She fed off the tiny tells, fear, nervousness, excuses. But this one stood like a still frame against the cluttered hardware store window. Too calm, too settled, too sure of herself. Rachel's palm brushed over her duty belt, fingers hovering near her handcuffs like muscle memory. She didn't need them yet, not unless the woman gave her lip. But Rachel was always ready for things to escalate. It was her favorite part of the job. That moment when she could flip the switch from petty harassment to full-blown authority. "Hey!" she barked again, sharper this time. "I said you got a reason to be standing here." The woman finally turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the voice behind her. Her eyes were calm, steady, unreadable. No tremor in her hands, no darting glance for exit routes, no defensive posture. She looked collected. Rachel hated collected. Collected people thought they had rights. "Just looking," the woman said softly. Her tone wasn't disrespectful. It wasn't anything, really. And somehow that made Rachel feel dismissed, ignored, like she wasn't a force to be reckoned with. Rachel stepped closer. "Looking at what?" "Just the display," the woman murmured, nodding toward the window. "That's all." "That's all," Rachel repeated mockingly. "On a block you don't live on. What, in front of a store you don't look like you ever shop at." A few passers-by slowed their pace but didn't stop. People knew better. When Officer Franklin was in one of her moods, the best thing was to keep moving and pretend you saw nothing. The woman's brows knit slightly. Confusion, not fear. "I didn't realize standing on a public sidewalk was a problem." "Oh, it is when you look like you're casing a place." Rachel circled slightly, forcing the woman to shift her stance so she could keep her in view. "Hands out of your pockets." The woman didn't move, not in refusal, more like she didn't understand the need. "My hands are warm," she said quietly. Rachel's jaw tightened. "Take them out. Now." Slowly, with a controlled patience that only made Rachel bristle further, the woman lifted her hands from the hoodie pocket. Empty. Bare. But no weapon. No threat. Rachel checked anyway, eyes flicking down her figure in a quick sweep. "You got ID on you?" she demanded. "For standing here?" the woman asked, genuinely puzzled. "For loitering," Rachel said, inventing the charge with confidence. "This is a high crime area. I don't know what you're doing, and you're acting suspicious." The woman glanced at the empty sidewalk, then back at Rachel. "I'm standing still. That's all." Rachel stepped into her space, close enough that the woman had to tilt her chin up slightly to maintain eye contact. Rachel loved this position, looming, intimidating, forcing the other person to acknowledge her power. "Look," Rachel said, lowering her voice to a threatening purr. "We're not going to play games. You're out here, watching this shop like you're planning something. So either you hand over some ID, or I can take you in and figure out who you are downtown." The woman blinked once, slow, measured. "Am I being detained?" Rachel almost smiled. She loved when they tried to quote rights like they knew the rules better than she did. "I'm conducting a lawful stop." "What is the reasonable suspicion?" the woman asked. Rachel rolled her tongue against the inside of her cheek, suppressing a flare of annoyance. "Your behavior." "I'm standing still." "And avoiding questions," Rachel shot back. "And refusing to show ID. And you're out here in front of a closed store before business hours. That's enough for me." The woman inhaled calmly, eyes flicking down for a split second, as if making a private calculation. That tiny break in eye contact, that pause, felt like victory to Rachel. "Turn around," Rachel ordered. "Hands on the car." The woman's brows rose. "For what reason?" Rachel stepped even closer, her voice rising. "Did I stutter? Turn. Around." A couple across the street slowed, watching from the corner of their eyes. Rachel noticed and puffed herself up even more. Public eyes didn't deter her. They empowered her. "I'm not resisting," the woman said gently, "but I'd like to know." Rachel grabbed her arm, hard. The woman gasped, not loudly, more in surprise than pain, but Rachel seized on the sound like confirmation. "Yeah," she hissed, yanking her toward the cruiser. "That's what I thought. Play dumb out here. Waste my time." The woman stumbled as Rachel pulled her, but she didn't fight back. Not even a twitch. She simply tried to keep her footing as Rachel slammed her forward and pressed her torso against the cold metal door of the squad car. "That hurt," the woman whispered. "That's the point," Rachel muttered, leaning her weight in. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Her radio crackled, but Rachel ignored it. She felt the rush, the electric charge of dominance that surged through her veins when she forced someone into submission. This was what made the job worth the early hours and endless paperwork. The woman rested her palms against the car, muscles coiled with restrained tension. Not fear, not panic. Something else. Something steady. Rachel didn't notice. She was too busy convincing herself she'd picked the right target. Too busy believing she was in control. Too busy feeding the deep, the ugly satisfaction that came from asserting power over someone who wouldn't even raise their voice. "Let's see who you really are," Rachel sneered, reaching for the cuffs. She had no idea how big a mistake she was making. Rachel's grip tightened the moment the woman's voice stayed steady. That calm wasn't compliance in Rachel's mind. It was defiance dressed up in manners, the kind that made her feel challenged, like she was being measured and found wanting. Rachel didn't do well with being measured. She didn't do well with anything that suggested she wasn't the uncontested authority in the space between her boots and the curb. "You want to get slick with me?" Rachel snapped, shifting her weight so the cruiser door pinned the woman's hip. "You want to start talking like you know the law?" The woman's cheek was turned toward the cold metal, her breath controlled. Her hands stayed open, palms flat against the car, exactly where Rachel had ordered them. "I'm not trying to be slick," she said quietly. "I'm asking a question." Rachel laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You don't ask questions, I ask questions." A radio voice crackled again, faint and tinny, something about traffic detail. Rachel flicked her eyes to the dash, then back, annoyed that the world dared interrupt her moment. She wanted this simple. She wanted the woman to fold, to apologize, to scramble for a wallet like everyone else. Instead, she got stillness, poise, a tone that didn't beg. Rachel leaned in closer, her breath hot with coffee and irritation. "What's your name?" The woman paused, just a beat too long for Rachel's temper. "I don't consent to—" "That's it!" Rachel barked. She wrenched the woman's arm up and back with a sharp jerk, twisting it at the elbow. The woman's body jolted forward, a breath knocked from her lungs as her shoulder took the strain. "Stop!" the woman gasped, not screaming, but not flailing. Just a single word, sharp with pain. Rachel's eyes lit with vindication. Pain gave her what she wanted. Proof in her mind that the woman was acting up. "Now you're resisting," Rachel said, almost pleased. "Now we got something." "I'm not resisting," the woman managed, voice tight. "You're hurting me." Rachel shoved her harder, slamming her chest and cheek against the cruiser with enough force to make the metal thud. The sound echoed down the block, turning a few heads. A man across the street paused mid-step. A store owner froze with his broom half raised. No one crossed over. No one asked questions. The city knew this dance too well. Rachel wanted them to watch. She wanted the silent audience. It made her feel sanctioned. "Keep your hands where I told you," she growled, even though the woman's hands hadn't moved. "Do not move." The woman's fingers flexed once against the paint. Not to fight, just a reflex, a muscle answering pain. Rachel reacted like she'd been given permission. She shoved again, harder than before, pressing her weight into the woman's back and grinding her into the car, as if she could compress the calm out of her. "Do you think you're special?" Rachel hissed. "You come down here looking like you don't belong, acting like you don't have to answer me." The woman's eyes squeezed shut for a moment. When she opened them, the calm was still there, but now there was something else behind it. Focus. Not fear, not anger. Calculation. Rachel didn't recognize it. She wasn't used to being studied. "I'm standing on the sidewalk," the woman said through clenched teeth. "But that's not a crime. Your attitude is the crime," Rachel spat back without thinking. And then, as if she realized how stupid that sounded, she doubled down with force. "Spread your feet, wider." The woman shifted her stance, complying, careful and slow, so Rachel couldn't claim sudden movement. Her sneakers scraped lightly on the pavement. Rachel's hand shot to her wrist again. "Don't you move unless I tell you." The woman started. Rachel yanked her backward and then shoved her forward in one brutal motion, her shoulder slamming into the cruiser door with a hollow clang that made the woman wince. The officer's temper had become its own engine now, feeding itself, each second of calm from the woman interpreted as disrespect. On the other side of the street, the man with the paused step looked away and pretended to check his phone. The store owner returned to sweeping with stiff, angry strokes that kept his eyes down. Survival was a habit here. Rachel fumbled for her cuffs, her fingers quick and practiced. She hooked one bracelet around the woman's wrist. The metal clicked. "Finally," Rachel muttered, satisfied, like she'd won something hard-earned. The woman's breathing changed, still controlled but deeper, slower, deliberate. Rachel heard it and mistook it for panic. She pushed her forearm into the woman's back again, forcing her down. "Stop tensing up," Rachel ordered. "You're making it worse." "I'm trying to breathe," the woman said, voice strained. "You're leaning on me." Rachel tightened the cuff anyway, a cruel little twist, just enough to make the woman's shoulders jerk. "Maybe you should have thought about breathing before you decided to loiter." "I wasn't loitering," the woman said, and there it was again, that calm insistence, that refusal to crumble. Rachel's temper snapped like a wire pulled too tight. She grabbed the woman by the back of the hoodie and hauled her up roughly, then slammed her sideways into the squad car a third time, harder, as if trying to knock the composure out of her body. The woman's head hit metal with a dull impact. She sucked in air, eyes watering despite herself. Rachel leaned close to her ear. "You think you can stand there and play innocent? In my city? On my shift?" Her voice dropped to something low and dangerous. "I decide what you are." The woman swallowed, face pressed to cold paint, and for the first time her silence felt less like endurance and more like a choice. Like she was letting Rachel talk, letting her act, letting her commit to every ugly instinct with witnesses, with sound, with metal and bruises and a record that would not be denied. Rachel, blinded by her own rage, didn't see the trap taking shape around her. She only felt the rush of power, and she chased it right over the edge. Charlotte kept her cheek pressed to the cold metal of the cruiser door, her breath fogging faintly against the paint. Every shove, every twist, every insult came at her in sharp waves, but none of it broke her focus. Pain registered, yes, but pain wasn't new. Pain didn't override training. Pain didn't erase purpose. She absorbed it because she needed the full picture. She listened. She observed. She catalogued. Rachel Franklin didn't know it, but every second she spent barking commands, every time she escalated without cause, every time she tightened the cuff or shoved Charlotte's shoulder at the wrong angle, she was building a case. A perfect, airtight chain of misconduct, captured not on video, but in the memory of the one woman in the city whose word could topple an entire precinct. Charlotte forced her mind to stay sharp. She noted each violation like items on a checklist, no lawful reason for the stop. Bias-based assumptions, people like you. Escalation without threat. Unauthorized physical force, failure to state probable cause, improper handcuffing technique, deliberate infliction of pain, threatening language designed to intimidate, ignoring her own department's de-escalation protocols. And now, retaliation disguised as procedure. Every item slotted cleanly into place. Rachel shoved her again, harder than necessary, and Charlotte made a small, involuntary sound. Not loud, just a tight exhale that pushed through clenched teeth. "Oh, that get your attention?" Rachel taunted. "Thought you'd stay cute and quiet forever?" Charlotte focused on the cadence of the officer's voice. Anger permeated everything Rachel said. Anger without restraint. What without professionalism, without any grounding force that suggested she remembered the badge on her chest, meant something. Emotion before judgment. Pride before protocol. Domination before duty. Charlotte let her eyes flutter shut for a moment as she pressed her palms firmly against the cruiser. She replayed Franklin's approach from the first moment she saw the cruiser pull up. The stare, the suspicion without reason, the way she demanded hands out without articulating a threat, the coercive language, the lack of ID request until after she'd labeled Charlotte a problem. It all fit, it all tracked, it all screamed pattern. Rachel yanked the cuffed wrist again, forcing Charlotte's arm high enough that her muscles trembled. She didn't resist. Resistance would muddy the record. The cleanest evidence was always inaction met with unjustified force. "Stop moving," Rachel said, even though Charlotte hadn't moved at all. Another mental note. False verbal framing. Creating the illusion of resistance to justify force. Classic bad cop script writing. Charlotte opened her eyes. The reflection of the street flickered faintly in the cruiser window. Distorted shapes of passing pedestrians who deliberately kept distance. Wise, but heartbreaking. People learn to treat police brutality like weather. Unpredictable. Dangerous. Something to be endured from afar. Rachel leaned in again, her breath sharp at Charlotte's ear. I swear, you people never learn. There it was, the phrase Charlotte had been waiting for. Charged, biased, unprofessional. A statement steeped in exactly the kind of discriminatory contempt departments paid consultants thousands to scrub out of training manuals. Charlotte breathed slowly through the sting building in her wrist. She could feel the circulation pinching off. Rachel was too angry to notice, or too satisfied to care. "Look at you," Rachel continued, stepping back just enough to give Charlotte's body a cruel jerk with the arm she controlled. "Acting like butter wouldn't melt in your mouth. Newsflash, you don't get to stand around on corners like you own the place." Charlotte swallowed the hot coil of emotion forming in her throat. Not anger, not shame. Something colder, more controlled. A clarity that settled like frost across her thoughts. She remembered the exact department directives she herself had signed off on during her onboarding packet. She remembered which checklist items Rachel was trampling over. She remembered the mandatory bias training Rachel would have had to sit through, likely with her arms crossed, sighing dramatically through the slides. Charlotte tracked everything. Her peripheral vision caught motion. Someone across the street pulling out a phone, hesitating, then thinking better of it. Not out of indifference, out of fear. She didn't blame them. The city had trained people to look away for their own safety. Rachel's hand dropped to Charlotte's back again, pushing down until Charlotte had to brace her knees. "You know what? I'm done with this," Rachel said. "You're getting transported. We'll see how tough you are downtown." Transported for what? No articulated offense, no Miranda, no paperwork started. Threats used as leverage. Oh, Charlotte bit back a sharp inhale as Rachel jerked her upright again. The hinge of the handcuff scraped skin. She took a shallow breath. She mentally filed away the pain, the force, the unnecessary violence, the humiliation. This was exactly the rot she'd been hired to expose. Not theoretical, not whispered in hallways, not cushioned by euphemism. This was the real thing. Raw, unfiltered, unmasked. And she was collecting every second of it. Rachel forced her body sideways, preparing to open the rear door of the cruiser. Charlotte let the movement happen. She let herself be handled like someone with no agency, because she needed Rachel to finish telling on herself. Bullies always revealed everything if you let them keep talking. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," Rachel muttered. "Another day. I'd have run you in 5 minutes ago." Another violation. Threatening to arrest based on mood. Admitting selective enforcement. Leaning on fear instead of policy. Charlotte breathed through the pulse of pain at the base of her spine. She stared at her own reflection in the window, her face framed by Rachel's grip, her eyes steady and bright with a quiet fury Rachel couldn't see. Not yet. Rachel slammed her against the door one final time, like punctuation. Charlotte took it. Every bruise would serve a purpose. Every shove was a line in a report. Every insult, every twist of her arm, every unprovoked use of force was another nail in the coffin Rachel was building for herself. Charlotte endured it all. Because justice required patience. Because truth needed witnesses, even silent ones. Because when the time came for her to speak, she would have everything she needed to bury this officer's career so deep, even the department's dirtiest protectors couldn't dig her out. And Rachel Franklin, drunk on her temporary power, still had no idea she was handing Charlotte the shovel. The sergeant's cruiser rolled up with the unhurried ease of someone who already knew how the story was going to end before he heard it. Sergeant Paul Davies stepped out of his vehicle with the particular gait of a man who had spent 22 years learning how to look official without doing much of anything. He was broad-shouldered, thick through the middle, with a salt and pepper moustache that he kept trimmed with the same precision he applied to his paperwork, which was to say, just enough to pass inspection. His eyes swept the scene once, landed on Rachel, and softened with the quiet recognition of a man who had cleaned up after her before. "Franklin," he said, approaching with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "What have we got?" Rachel straightened immediately, the way she always did around Davies. Not out of respect, more like a student who'd been caught doing exactly what the teacher privately approved of. "Loitering suspect, refused to identify, became combative when I attempted to detain." Charlotte, still pressed against the cruiser with one wrist cuffed, turned her head slightly toward the sergeant. She said nothing. She waited. Davies looked at her, the way a man looks at a problem he's already decided to minimize. His gaze moved over her, the hoodie, the sneakers, the calm face, and something in his expression settled into a familiar, practiced neutrality, the kind that wasn't neutral at all. "She say anything?" he asked Rachel, not Charlotte. "Kept asking questions. Wouldn't comply. Started tensing up when I went to cuff her." Davies nodded slowly, like he was absorbing testimony rather than a one-sided account. He pulled out a small notepad, not to write anything yet, just to hold it. The notepad was a prop. Charlotte recognized it immediately. It was meant to signal authority, to suggest that whatever was said next was being officially recorded. It wasn't. "You got a name?" Davies asked Charlotte, finally addressing her directly. "I've been asking the same question," Rachel cut in, before Charlotte could respond. Charlotte looked at Davies steadily. "I was standing on the sidewalk. I wasn't loitering. I wasn't combative. I asked for the reason for the stop, and was physically assaulted before receiving an answer." Davies blinked once. Then he smiled, a small, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, Officer Franklin has the authority to conduct investigative stops in high-crime areas." "As if you were uncooperative." "I wasn't uncooperative," Charlotte said, keeping her voice even. "I asked a legal question." Davies turned back to Rachel as if Charlotte hadn't spoken. "She resist at all? Physically?" Rachel hesitated for just a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that meant she was calculating rather than remembering. "She pulled away when I went to cuff her. I had to use minimal force to secure her." Charlotte filed it away instantly. False statement, fabricated resistance, delivered in front of a superior officer present and receiving it without challenge. Davies wrote something on the notepad. Charlotte couldn't see what, but she could guess. He was building the scaffolding of a story, not documenting facts, but constructing a version of events that would hold up long enough to get Rachel out of trouble and Charlotte into a cell. "Okay," Davies said, clicking his pen. "Here's what we're going to do. We'll run her name, check for priors, and if she's clean, we process her for obstruction and release her with a citation." He glanced at Rachel. "You said she was blocking the entrance to the store." Rachel caught on immediately. "Yeah. Owner's been having issues with people hanging around out front. I was responding to a complaint." There was no complaint. Charlotte knew it. Davies likely suspected it. Rachel had invented it in real time, and Davies had handed her the thread to pull. Charlotte's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Fabricated probable cause. Sergeant coaching officer on false narrative. Conspiracy to falsify an arrest report. But Davies leaned against the cruiser beside Charlotte, close enough to lower his voice. "Look," he said, almost gently. "If you just give us your name and address, we can get this sorted quickly. No reason for this to get bigger than it needs to be." It was a threat wrapped in kindness. Charlotte had heard it 100 times in internal affairs files. The soft version of the blue wall, not a shout, but a whisper. Not a shove, but a hand on the shoulder steering you away from the truth. "I understand what you're doing," Charlotte said quietly. Davies's eyes narrowed slightly. "Excuse me." "I said I understand what you're doing," she repeated, without heat, without accusation, just clarity. Davies straightened. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, but wariness. A flicker of instinct that told him this woman was different, not even if he couldn't name why. He looked at her again, more carefully this time. The calm, the posture, the way she absorbed everything without breaking. He almost asked the question forming behind his eyes. Almost. But 22 years of protecting the wall had trained him to silence that instinct, to choose the easier story over the complicated truth. He turned back to Rachel. "Finish processing her. I'll handle the report." Rachel smiled, a quick, satisfied flash of teeth. "Copy that, Sarge." Davies walked back toward his cruiser, already composing the language in his head. Resisting detention, failure to identify, obstruction, clean, simple charges that would bury the real story under enough paperwork to make it disappear. Charlotte watched him go. She noted the time. She noted his badge number, visible when he leaned in. She noted the exact words he used. She noted the exact words Rachel used in response. She noted the coaching, the fabrication, the conspiracy dressed up as procedure. The blue wall had just shown itself in full. And Charlotte had memorized every brick. Rachel reached for the loose cuff dangling from the chain, metal glinting in the weak morning light. The first bracelet already bit into Charlotte's right wrist, skin reddened and pinched. The second hung open, ready to close the trap. "Left wrist," Rachel barked. "Bring it back." Charlotte didn't move right away. Not out of resistance, but because she could feel the shift in the air before the sound caught up. The subtle thickening of attention on the block. The way conversations dipped, then died. The way a city street, used to the rhythm of sirens and shouting, suddenly went still. Engines approached, low and smooth. Not the whine of patrol cars. Something heavier. Quieter. Intentional. Davies glanced up first, hand still holding his notepad. 2 black SUVs turned onto the street, was moving in formation, too coordinated to be coincidence. No music, no rush, no aggressive revving. They rolled with the patient inevitability of a tide. Rachel didn't notice. She was focused on Charlotte's hand, fingers curled against the metal of the cruiser. "I said bring your left wrist back," she repeated, voice edged with irritation. The SUVs closed the distance. One slid in front of Rachel's cruiser, cutting off its nose. The other eased into the space behind it, sealing in the lane. No lights, no sirens. Just presence. Pedestrians stopped pretending not to watch. A vendor lowering his gate paused halfway and left it there. The man who'd earlier looked away from Charlotte and her assault now turned back, eyes flickering between the boxed-in squad car and the unmarked vehicles. But everyone on the block understood something without being told. This wasn't routine. Davies straightened, his posture shifting. His gaze darted from the SUVs to Rachel, then to Charlotte, still pinned against the car. "Franklin," he called, his voice a touch tighter. "Hold up a second." Rachel frowned over her shoulder. "I almost got her secured, Sarge." "I said hold up," he snapped, more sharply this time. Charlotte heard the new note in his voice. Wariness. edged with a concern he hadn't shown when she complained of pain. Doors opened on both SUVs with a synchronized thud. 3 people stepped out of the first vehicle, 2 from the second. Suits, no uniforms. Their movements were crisp, economical. No wasted gestures, no casual stroll. They walked like they'd already briefed this scene in the car, and were now just matching reality to expectations. One of them, a tall black woman with close-cropped hair and the kind of posture that came from years of formal service, scanned the scene in a single sweep. Her gaze moved from the hardware store to the onlookers, to Davies, to Rachel, and finally, lingering just a moment longer, on Charlotte. Davies felt the chill run down his spine before he recognized her. Internal affairs. He didn't know her name, but he knew the type. Investigators had a particular stillness to them, like they were always listening for what wasn't being said. The second man, shorter, with a lean build and grey at his temples, flashed his credentials with practiced speed. "Sergeant Davies," he called, as if he were reading the name from a file he'd already memorized. "Officer Franklin." Rachel's fingers froze over the open cuff. She turned, brows knitted. "Yeah? Can I help?" Her voice faltered as she fully took them in. The badges clipped to their belts weren't the familiar shield of patrol. They were the flat, sober emblems of people who didn't answer to the precinct. Davies stepped forward, notepad disappearing into his pocket. "What's this about?" he asked, tone attempting casual and landing somewhere closer to defensive. "We got a situation under control here." The tall woman from IA didn't answer him directly. Her eyes drifted pointedly to Charlotte's pinned body, the single cuff, the reddened wrist, the way Rachel's hand still hovered too close to the joint. "Is that so?" she said quietly. Oh, Charlotte breathed out slowly through her nose, careful not to let the satisfaction show on her face. Timing. They'd cut it close, but perfectly. "Ma'am," the grey-templed investigator addressed Charlotte, his voice gentle in a way neither patrol officer had managed. "Are you injured?" Rachel bristled. "You don't talk to her," she snapped. "She's under detention, and you're interfering with Officer Franklin." The IA woman's gaze snapped to her, cool and unblinking. "Stand away from the detainee. Now!" Rachel's mouth opened, then closed. The authoritative tone was one she recognized even if she didn't like it. She took a half step back, hand dropping away from Charlotte's arm. Charlotte straightened slowly, muscles protesting, cheek peeling away from the metal. She didn't fully turn yet. Not until the moment was right. She kept her cuffed wrist raised slightly, the steel glinting in the new tableau. Davies tried to reclaim control. "Look, this is my scene," he said, forcing a smile. "If you had questions, you could have called ahead. We've got a non-compliant subject here who, according to dispatch," the grey-templed investigator cut in, "was reported as a suspicious person watching a storefront. That was your phrasing, Officer Franklin?" Rachel blinked. That's correct." The IA woman nodded slowly. "We pulled the call audio on the way over. You did not mention a crime. You did not reference a complainant. You did, however, describe the individual as a black female in a hoodie standing too long in front of a shop." The word hung there. Black. Too long. Rachel flushed, the first hint of unease cracking through her arrogant composure. "Well, yeah, but this is a problem area. People loiter. And she became violent," the investigator pressed. Rachel seized on the lifeline. "Absolutely. She tensed up, refused to show ID, wouldn't answer questions. I had to use force to restrain her. Minimal force." Charlotte almost laughed at that. minimal. The IA woman turned to Davies. "And you corroborate this claim, Sergeant? You witnessed physical resistance?" Davies cleared his throat. "I arrived after the initial contact. Officer Franklin briefed me on the subject's behavior, and I—" "So that's a no," the investigator said crisply. "You did not personally witness any resistance." He shut his mouth. The block had gone silent. Phones were out now, less hesitant than a few minutes ago, as people sensed a different kind of performance playing out, one where the usual roles might not hold. The grey-templed investigator looked back at Charlotte. "Ma'am? Again? Are you injured?" Charlotte finally turned her head fully, meeting his eyes. Hers were bright, steady, very much awake. She smiled, a small, controlled curve of the lips. "I'll answer that," she said, her voice calm and clear. "In a moment." Rachel scoffed. "You answer when you're—" The IA woman's hand lifted, palm outward, silencing her. "Officer Franklin, step to the curb," she ordered. "Sergeant, you as well." Davies bristled. "On what authority are you?" "On the authority of internal affairs," she replied, flipping her credentials with slow, deliberate clarity. "You were both notified of a special operations directive this morning. Check your email if you missed it." Email. Davies's hand went to his phone instinctively. He hadn't checked anything since roll call. Rachel didn't even pretend. She'd deleted half those memos on sight. Unmarked black sedans, IA on the street. Dispatch logs pulled in real time. Charlotte exhaled once, letting the moment stretch just a beat longer. She wanted them off balance, confused, uncertain enough to show all their tells. The cavalry had arrived, but not for the officers. Charlotte stood in the center of the boxed-in lane, the single handcuff still dangling from her right wrist like a piece of discarded jewelry. She didn't rush to take it off. She didn't rub the red welt forming on her skin. Instead, she reached into the inner pocket of her hoodie with a slow, deliberate grace that made Rachel Franklin flinch toward her holster. "Don't move!" Rachel barked, her voice cracking with a sudden, sharp desperation. The internal affairs investigator stepped between them instantly, her hand raised in a silent, iron-clad command for Rachel to stand down. Charlotte's hand emerged. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a leather wallet, worn at the edges, which she flipped open with a crisp, practiced snap. The gold shield inside caught the morning sun, throwing a jagged glint of light across the hood of the cruiser. "Officer Rachel Franklin, badge number 4492, Charlotte said. Her voice had changed. The soft, questioning tone of the vagrant was gone, replaced by a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. "Assigned to the 14th Precinct, 3 years on patrol. 2 prior sustained complaints for excessive force, 1 for biased policing, and a pending investigation into a falsified arrest report from last November." Rachel's face didn't just go pale. It turned a sickly, translucent grey. Her jaw hung slack, her eyes darting from the gold badge to the woman she had just slammed against a car. The air seemed to leave her lungs in a long, stuttering hiss. "Sarge," Rachel stammered, looking toward Davies for a lifeline that wasn't there. And Sergeant Davies was staring at the badge, his notepad slipping from his fingers and hitting the asphalt with a dull thud. He knew that shield. He knew the name that went with the appointment. He knew that the woman he had just coached into a lie was the only person in the city who could end his pension with a single signature. "Commissioner Law," Davies whispered, the words sounding like a confession. Charlotte straightened her hoodie, pulling the fabric taut with a sharp tug that felt more formal than a tailored blazer. She stepped into Rachel's personal space, the same way Rachel had done to her. But Charlotte didn't need to loom. Her authority did the work for her. "You looked at me this morning, and you saw a target," Charlotte said, her voice low and dangerous. "You saw someone you thought didn't have a voice, someone who wouldn't be believed, someone you could break just to feel the weight of your own badge. You didn't see a citizen. You didn't even see a human being." Rachel tried to speak, her throat working convulsively, but no sound came out. She looked like she was shrinking, her shoulders curling inward as the reality of her situation began to crush her. "And you, Sergeant Davies." Charlotte turned her gaze to the older man. He didn't look away, but his eyes were wet with the sudden, terrifying realization of his own ruin. "You didn't ask for the facts. You didn't check the body cam. You didn't even look at the scene. You walked up and immediately began building a wall of lies to protect a bully. You are the reason this department is rotting from the inside out." The IA investigators stood like statues, at their presence a silent barrier between the corrupt officers and the world they had tried to manipulate. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown, but the silence was absolute. Even the city seemed to hold its breath. Charlotte held up her cuffed wrist, the metal clicking softly. "This was supposed to be a plainclothes inspection. I wanted to see the truth of this precinct. I wanted to see if the rumors of systemic abuse were exaggerated." She looked Rachel directly in the eye, her gaze as cold as the metal of the handcuffs. "You gave me more than I ever expected, Officer Franklin. You gave me everything I need." Rachel's knees buckled slightly, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the cruiser, the same cruiser she had used as a weapon minutes before. The arrogance that had defined her entire morning had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified woman who finally understood that the untouchable had been touched. "Commissioner, I didn't know," Rachel managed to choke out, her voice a thin, pathetic reed. "That's the problem, Franklin," Charlotte replied, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You only respect the power you can see. You think the law is a weapon for you to use, rather than a standard for you to live by. You didn't know who I was, so you thought I was nothing." Charlotte turned to the lead IA investigator. "Take the cuff off, and then take her badge." The investigator stepped forward. The click of the key in the lock was the only sound on the street, a sharp, final punctuation mark on Rachel Franklin's career. As the metal fell away, Charlotte didn't look at her wrist. She looked at the city, her eyes already moving past the two broken officers toward the work that lay ahead. The reveal was over. The reckoning had begun. The IA investigator held the handcuff key loosely between two fingers, the small piece of metal suddenly carrying the weight of everything the morning had become. He stepped toward Charlotte with a quiet deference that Rachel Franklin, standing 3 feet away, couldn't help but notice. That deference, directed at the woman she had shoved against a car, landed like a physical blow. Charlotte extended her wrist. The cuff fell open. She lowered her arm slowly, rolled her shoulder once, and then stood completely still while the investigator stepped back. No dramatics, no visible relief, just a woman reclaiming her posture and her authority in the same unhurried breath. Rachel watched it happen and felt the ground shift beneath her boots. "Commissioner," the grey-templed investigator said, producing a small evidence bag. "Whenever you're ready." Charlotte nodded once. She turned to face Rachel fully. The morning light had climbed higher now, burning off the last of the early haze, and it fell across the street with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, like the city itself had decided to illuminate this moment. Rachel stood in it, exposed, her uniform suddenly looking less like authority and more like a costume she no longer had the right to wear. "Badge and firearm, Officer Franklin," Charlotte said. Not a request, not a suggestion, a directive delivered with the quiet finality of a door being closed forever. Rachel's mouth worked silently. Her hand moved to her badge instinctively, fingers hovering over it the way a person hovers over something they know they're about to lose. "Commissioner, please," she started, and her voice stripped of every ounce of the swagger that had defined her morning. "If I could just explain." "You explained yourself thoroughly," Charlotte said, "for the past 40 minutes. Rachel's fingers trembled as she unclipped the badge from her chest. The small act of removing it seemed to cost her something physical. Her shoulders dropped, her chin dipped, her entire frame deflated like a structure whose load-bearing wall had just been pulled. She held it out with a shaking hand. Charlotte didn't take it herself. She nodded to the investigator, who stepped forward and received it with gloved hands, sliding it into the evidence bag with a soft, irreversible zip. "Firearm," Charlotte said. Rachel unholstered her weapon with the mechanical compliance of someone operating on autopilot. As the muscle memory of the job carrying her through motions her mind could no longer process. The investigator took it, bagged it, tagged it. Rachel Franklin stood on the sidewalk in a uniform that no longer meant anything, her hands empty, her face a portrait of a woman watching her entire identity dissolve in real time. Charlotte turned to Davies. The sergeant hadn't moved. He stood with his hands at his sides, his notepad still on the ground where it had fallen, his eyes carrying the hollow look of a man who had already begun calculating the damage. 22 years, pension, reputation, all of it balanced on the edge of the next few seconds. "Sergeant Paul Davies," Charlotte said, her voice carrying clearly across the block. "You are hereby suspended without pay, pending a full internal affairs investigation into your conduct this morning, including your role in coaching a false narrative, fabricating probable cause, and conspiring to falsify an official arrest report." Davies closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the calculation was gone. What remained was something older and quieter, the look of a man who had known, somewhere deep down, that this day was always coming. "Your badge and weapon," Charlotte said. He complied without a word. No pleading, no excuses. Just the slow, defeated movements of a man who had spent 2 decades protecting the wrong things. Charlotte watched the evidence bags close around both sets of credentials, then turned to face the street. The crowd had thickened considerably. Residents, vendors, commuters who had missed their buses and didn't care. Phones were raised. Eyes were wide. The city was watching. Good. She wanted it to watch. "Officer Franklin," Charlotte said, raising her voice just enough to carry, "you are under arrest for assault under color of law, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority. You have the right to remain silent." The gray-templed investigator moved behind Rachel, producing his own cuffs. The click of the metal closing around Rachel's wrists echoed off the storefronts with a sharp, poetic finality. Rachel flinched at the sound. The same sound she had used as a weapon all morning, now turned entirely against her. Charlotte let the moment breathe. Then she turned to face the gathered crowd, the phones, the witnesses, the city that had learned too well to look away. My name is Charlotte Law," she said, her voice clear and unhurried. "I am the incoming police commissioner of this city. I took this walk this morning because I needed to see the truth of this department with my own eyes." She paused, letting the weight of that settle. "What I witnessed today was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom, and as of this moment, the treatment ends and the surgery begins. No one spoke. The street held its collective breath. Every officer in this department will be reviewed. Every sustained complaint will be reopened. Every false report will be audited. Every wall of silence will be dismantled, brick by brick, until what remains is a department that actually deserves the trust of the people it serves. A vendor near the back of the crowd began to clap, a single, though slow rhythm that others picked up gradually, spreading down the block like a current finding its channel. Charlotte didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a moment for reckoning, and reckonings demanded gravity. She looked once more at Rachel Franklin, now seated in the back of an unmarked IA vehicle, her face pressed toward the window, with the stunned, hollow expression of someone who had spent years believing consequences were for other people. Charlotte held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. Because Rachel Franklin was no longer the point. She was the beginning. The first brick pulled from a wall that had stood far too long. There were hundreds more to go, and Charlotte had already started counting. She buttoned the top of her hoodie against the morning chill, squared her shoulders, and turned toward the IA lead. I want a full precinct review initiated by end of day. Pull every body cam from the 14th going back 18 months. Cross-reference every use of force report with medical records from the processing center. Yes, Commissioner. And get me a press briefing at noon. She glanced back at the cruiser, still boxed in by the black SUVs, sitting in the middle of the street like a monument to the morning's events. The city deserves to hear this directly. She walked past the cruiser without looking at it again. Behind her, the crowd parted. Ahead of her, the city stretched wide and complicated and broken in ways that would take years to repair. But repair required a starting point, and Charlotte Law had just chosen hers. A cold metal door on a quiet block, a pair of handcuffs, and the absolute certainty that no one, not a single officer in this city, was above the law she had sworn to uphold. The purge had begun, and it had begun exactly where it needed to, in the open, in the light, where everyone could see. If you felt the justice in your chest when those cuffs clicked on Franklin's wrists, don't stop here. Hit the like and subscribe, so you never miss a moment of karmic justice. What would you have said to Franklin if you were in Charlotte's shoes? Because when the hunters become the hunted, the story is just getting started.